This podcast was just a vague idea when I asked Anna Reid to be a guest, and I did a little scream when she agreed. She is one of my favourite historians. I read Borderland, her history of Ukraine, just after Putin's large-scale invasion in 2022. The book made me appreciate why successfully resisting Russia is psychologically important for Ukrainians. As well as discussing that conflict, we talk about her most recent book, A Nasty Little War, in which she tells the story of Britain's disastrous attempt at reversing the Bolshevik Revolution. We explore why Britain failed to turn the White Russians into an effective fighting force, how fascistic White Russian leaders influence the Kremlin today, and why this whole period is so awkward for Putin's grand narrative about Russian history. I hope you enjoy the talk. So Anna Reid, thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest on my podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
So I'm going to begin with asking, what's your favourite word?
Ooh, my favourite word. No, you haven't prepared me for this one. Oh my goodness. I'll come back to it. I'll try and think of a favourite word.
What's your least favourite word?
Oh, okay. Tick. I'm in Ireland on holiday, and I found woke up this morning covered in them after a long walk yesterday.
What's your favourite swear word?
My favourite swear word? Bugger. I use that far too much.
Well, I was going to ask, are there any notable times in your career that you've used it?
Oh, yeah, I probably should have used it more, actually. Could have been more assertive at times, I guess. Yeah.
What's your favourite book?
Favourite book? Well, I'm in Ireland, and I've very much enjoyed Paul Murray's The Bee Sting, which is a great, big, fat, sort of sprawling family saga. A lot of sharp social observation in it, and just sort of a human heart. Yeah, beautifully written. He's terrific.
What's a sound or noise that you love?
What's a sound? Oh gosh. I always find sort of steam trains, galloping hooves, trumpets, all those kind of heart-lifting sounds are rather wonderful. Sheep, owls, all that kind of thing.
What's the sound or noise that you hate?
Oh, the reversing thing in the car. The thing which bleeps when you've got too close.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Oh, guilty pleasures. Crisps. Specifically at the moment, potatoes, cheese and onion flavour crisps.
What was the last thing that made you laugh?
Oh, what's the last thing that really made me laugh? Oh my goodness, that really made me laugh. That Paul Murray book, The Bee Sting, that's got some great laughs in it.
I was rereading A Nasty Little War, and I did laugh at the officer that loved his angel mother. That made me laugh the other day. His letters to his angel mother.
I got all that when I was writing it. I enjoyed the language. It's a very period language. These diarists, these all my sort of interventionist officers use. People are rotters and things are top hole. Marvelous. Bertie Wooster goes to Murmansk. That was the title of actually one of my reviews. That made me smile.
Is there a fictional character that you imagine yourself to be?
Oh, a fictional character. Now, I know you've asked some of your previous interviewees this, so I did think about this. And I love sort of gutsy female protagonists. The ones that I love the Becky Sharps. I mean, there are quite a lot of these sort of go-getting, ruthless. I mean, hateful, but also you can't help rooting for them. Go-getting heroines, or sort of anti-heroines.
So you studied law as an undergraduate, but you did your master's in Russian history. I'm curious what drew you to the country and why did you make that change?
Well, I never went on to become a lawyer at all, so I swapped away from that early on. But I think I'm 59, so for my age group, there were two sort of great sort of international issues that were developing very fast and dramatically while we were in our sort of late teens and 20s. And one was the end of apartheid, the release Mandela coming out of jail and the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the the anti-apartheid movement before that. And the other, of course, was the collapse of the communist bloc, the fall of the wall and then the collapse of the Soviet Union and everything that followed from that. And I was particularly swept up in the latter. I mean, really by chance. And that I was off in Sweden as an au pair girl in my first summer of university, and I got the sack. I was really, really hopeless at looking after small children. And so I got a ferry across from Gothenburg to northern Poland and spent several weeks traveling around Poland on my own. And this was in 84. So it was in the middle of martial law. So the solidarity movement had got going and then been squashed again. And there was very repressive martial law in place. But where they hadn't, the authorities hadn't dared clamp down, of course, on the Catholic Church. So churches and the churchyard surrounding them had become places of permanent pro-democracy protest. They were all filled with these enormous crowds 24 hours a day and posters and banners and people singing and chanting. And I was all on my own. So people, kind Poles, young Poles, sort of swept me up and took me along with them and explained the situation to me. And lots of them had their passports confiscated by the authorities. Actually, one of them was all set to go to Oxford, where I was. And he had his passport taken and his future had collapsed in front of him. And I found I hadn't been anywhere in the Eastern Bloc before, and it wasn't, somewhere people went on holiday or knew about or had friends from. It was this sort of blank space off in the East, and meeting all these people, and also in this country, which is sort of so familiar. Northern, Poland looks much like northern France, and all the, the architecture. It's all what one knows from, other European cities, and so it was almost like meeting a whole bunch of cousins who had been sort of, locked up by a sort of wicked uncle, all these years, and you were meeting them for the first time, and of course you sympathise with them. And so I sort of that was really what started me off on that, on what I'm still doing today, wrapped up in Russia and Ukraine.
The Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War has sort of always fascinated me, but it's not an area that's well known, especially in the West. I remembered yesterday, years and years ago, I was reading a very heavy academic text about General Ironside's campaign in the North. And I actually tried to find it on Amazon and I couldn't remember the name. I vaguely remember the cover. But it sort of seemed to me that I can't ever remember seeing many accessible, well-written books about the conflict. There was an overview of the whole campaign and put the campaign into the bigger context until your book. So I'm curious, when were you interested in the intervention and what led you to wanting to write about it?
Well, it's wonderful to find a subject which isn't already, a good sort of big subject, not a little niche subject, which isn't already well trodden ground. And you're right. I mean, before I wrote my book, it was generally, there were little sections about it in general books about the Russian Civil War as a whole. Or there are a few sort of technical military histories about one particular campaign. So just about the North, or just about the Siberia, or just about the South. Usually the most of them are about the North, because that's where British and American troops were involved in actual fighting rather than just sort of supplying and training and distributing arms. The reason it hasn't been written about is really because it was swept under the carpet after it failed. It was a humiliating disaster. Obviously, the Reds won and Lenin and Trotsky stayed in power. And so afterwards, the top brass and the politicians involved sort of distanced themselves in their memoirs, or they blame shifted, or they simply said as little about it as possible. But it was easier to allied the whole thing with the memory of the Great War, of the war against Germany. So if you look at war memorials, you'll often see, where it gives where the person was killed, where the man was killed. You'll see, all these familiar names like sort of Ypres and the Somme and so on. And then sometimes you'll see Murmansk or something like that, this Russian name. And you might spot that this is 1919 he was killed. How come? The war's over. And he wasn't fighting Germany. He was fighting the Reds in Russia. He was an interventionist. And the whole thing was sort of, it was ignored as far as possible, really, in official circles. There was no official history was written, no campaign medals were issued. So yeah, it was a great chance for me. It's lovely to be able to do something which is a first pass at something. You're not just sort of refreshing and updating other people's work.
I also imagine it's one of those periods of history that it captures both a past and a future. It's sort of everything that was to come can be seen in that moment, and then there's also everything that came before. It seems like one of those periods where it's just perfectly encapsulated and like a hinge moment.
Yeah, I think so. I agree. I find that just immediately after the First World War, and the sort of the world re-emerges from this cataclysm, and three great empires, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, have collapsed, and all these new nations are being sort of born in their ruins. And all the social changes, 1918, the first election at which women could vote in Britain, and so on. And similar great sort of social changes elsewhere. It's where the 20th century that we all recognise, and a lot of us grew up in, really begins. The world that we're familiar with emerges. But my interventionists, they were interesting because all these sort of the British officers in particular, less so the Americans, but they are old-fashioned men. They are old-fashioned for their time. So they've grown up in the era of sort of Freud and Joyce, the beginnings of modernism, but that touches their worldview not at all. Their sort of worldview is still Edwardian. It's sort of empire, faith, country. And they're remarkably all out of the same box. Actually, they've all had the same backgrounds. They've all been sort of brought up in the counties somewhere, been to a public school, been to Greenwich or to Sandhurst, and then sent off to the Great War. So their whole lives are very institutionalized, and they're incredibly emotionally repressed. We know all about the stiff upper lip from the era, but it's really striking. So there was one man, and he writes an interesting series of letters to his parents, and he's very interesting about what he's doing, but he doesn't give away much. He talks a bit about his feelings, but not a lot. But at one point, his handwriting suddenly gets worse, and he says, "Mum, see how I'm getting on. Look at how I'm getting on with my left arm. It'll amuse you." And you realise he's lost his right arm. And there's another man who says, again, a long series of letters from Siberia to his mother again. And it's all very sort of jolly chit chat. He makes light of everything. He turns everything into a funny story. And then he says, "I know on this day you'll be thinking of Edmund. I am too." That's all he says. And looking him up, you realise that this was the day on which his brother had been killed in France like a year previously. But that's absolutely typical. They have this unquenchable appetite also for spending their free time off shooting, going on shooting expeditions in these sort of bogs and woods. Usually all through the middle of winter, they don't just sort of sit as comfortably as they can in barracks. They head off for the whole day and get unbelievably cold and wet, sort of sitting about in the rushes waiting for snipe. They just are. They're incredibly tough, and they're incredibly stiff upper lip. Reading between the lines often of this sort of terrific sort of emotional restraint. That was something one had to do.
Something I loved about the book is the how annoyed the Russians seem to be of this British attitude of like somehow simultaneously naive and also sort of materialistic. It's sort of this very can-do attitude, and I think you talk about, I think it was in Archangel that Russians started to refer to British people as come-ons, and basically because English people are always saying come on, and there just seems to be like this. It almost made me feel vaguely patriotic of just how sort of how sort of naive and insulated these British people were, but just with a sort of like good intentions being the road to hell kind of thing. It's sort of the British full of good intentions and just sort of causing mayhem as they went.
The come on thing, a couple of people told me, I didn't hear anyone refer to Brits as kumoni, come oners, in the north, but apparently this is still used as a nickname, because they were always going, come on, to Russian troops they were trying to train, and to each other, obviously. But yeah, on sort of relations between the Russian officers who the British ones and American ones were, having to work alongside. These were white officers, it was part of the Russian anti-Bolshevik forces. They were generally very bad from the start. Some of the Brits were not the Americans. The Americans all thought that this was an appalling venture right from the start, and they were the ones who got sent to Russia pre the armistice. They were particularly angry because they'd been sent to, and they'd come to Europe thinking they were going to fight the Kaiser, and then they find themselves fighting to restore, as they see it, the bloody autocratic Tsar. And they basically think it's a misbegotten, adventure right from the start. And later on, interviewed in old age, they often compare the whole thing to Vietnam. And some of the Brits, in contrast, were ideologically committed. They feared the spread of revolution, and they felt that this was an important cause. But most, particularly the regular officers, the career officers, were angry at being sent to Russia pre-armistice because they wanted to be in at the kill. That was the phrase of the time in France. They wanted to be fighting the important war against the Germans, not sort of shunted off to this sideshow. And if they signed up for Russia after the armistice, because the intervention carried on up all the way up to 1920, it was because they wanted more active service. They wanted more prospects, opportunities for promotion. So they would generally land in Russia, sign in with the British military mission, and then go and introduce themselves to their Russian opposite numbers. And they would very quickly become either exasperated with or actually sort of outright dislike their Russian colleagues. And the Russians, Russians reciprocated. Broadly speaking, we thought they were sort of disorganized, drunken, and reactionary. And they thought we were arrogant and ignorant and naive. And everybody was right. All these things were true.
That kind of leads to my next question, which is, my definition of strategy is it's trying to achieve your ambitions as stuff outside your control tries to stop you. And what struck me reading A Nasty Little War pretty much on every page was that the Allies had no idea what they wanted from the intervention. Whichever goal they happened to momentarily decide upon, they had no idea how to go about achieving it. And so they just got overwhelmed by all the stuff that was happening in sort of revolutionary Russia.
I don't think it's quite fair to say they didn't know what they wanted. What was clearly wanted was to overthrow, the new Bolshevik regime in Moscow and get rid of Lenin and Trotsky. But the reason why we wanted to do this changed. So initially, it was because we wanted to reanimate the Eastern Front. So the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany and allowed Germany to occupy Ukraine and the Baltics, and started supplying Germany with coal and wheat and so on. So we didn't care who took over in Russia. From our point of view, it could be anybody, from another variety of revolutionary to restoration of the monarchy, as long as they pulled the Russian army back together again and started fighting Germany again. When Germany's beaten in the West at the end of 1918, that reason for intervention collapses, and at that stage it becomes an ideological war. It becomes a war against Bolshevism, against revolution, because it was genuinely feared. There were genuine, widespread fears on the right that revolution would spread west. They were explicit. They'd founded the Comintern. They were explicitly committed to worldwide revolution, the new Bolshevik leadership. And there was a massive wave of strikes and demonstrations sort of all over the Western world in 1919. And of course, then you've got unrest in Egypt, you've got the beginnings of the Irish War of Independence. It was all for the establishment, the world looked extremely precarious, and the events in Russia seemed to be a precursor for what was now going on elsewhere. And people like Churchill saw it all as connected, everything from Cork to Calcutta. But of course, by the end of 1919, when all the White Armies were in full retreat and Allied forces, interventionist forces along with them, fleeing along the railway lines to Vladivostok and down to Novorossiysk, it became clear that that it wasn't going to work, and we simply needed to get out.
I mean, the impression I got was that between sort of the Allied leaderships, there was disagreement over exactly why they should be there, and then President Wilson says American troops shouldn't be engaged fighting the Bolsheviks. And then the British commander on the ground in the north uses American troops to push out against the Bolsheviks. So I sort of felt like there was all that confusion about the no agreed policy. Clemenceau wanted one thing, David Lloyd George wanted another. And then when you combine that with, there was a really good line from an official about sort of how many factions there were among the White Russians. We received supreme leaders between 7 and 12, dictators between 12 and 3, and prime ministers from 3 to 5. So to me, it was the Allies were sort of struggling of like what exactly they want, trying to maneuver through all these so many different factions. And then I felt like the players who were most successful in this conflict were the ones who knew exactly what they wanted. So whether it was Lenin or the Japanese or the Baltic states, they had a very clear end goal that they wanted, and they just kind of drove towards it.
Yes, that's right. The Allied governments were not united. So initially, keenest and sort of fiercest on intervention was Clemenceau of France, who he personally hated violent radicalism because he had lived through the Commune in Paris and seen the sort of appalling, sort of mass executions and then reprisals and so on that went on there. And so he, despite the fact he was a lifelong socialist and had, been imprisoned for his pro-democracy journalism, when he was a young man, he loathed the Bolsheviks with a passion. And when Russia dropped out of the war, he saw this as a sort of heinous betrayal. And of course, France, was suffering. It was under occupation. It was suffering much more from the war against Germany than either Britain or America. Woodrow Wilson of America, on the other hand, he was very reluctant to get involved. He'd been reluctant to get involved in the war against Germany. I mean, he only joined the war against Germany at the beginning of 1917. There was a lot of diplomatic pressure needed to get him to contribute American troops to the intervention in 1918. And sort of in between was Lloyd George, and he tended to sort of haver depending on how events in Russia were going. He swung this way and that. But towards the end of the intervention, he allowed himself to be swayed by Churchill, who was passionately anti-Bolshevik and refused to listen to the cooler heads or sort of, bad news from Russia. He only listened to, he'd only hear what he wanted to hear. And he classically got trapped in groupthink. And Lloyd George basically let him carry on with a new phase of the intervention in the south, in Ukraine, through 1919, and should have called it off earlier.
A line in the book that really struck me is that when you said Vladimir Putin struggles to fit the White Russians into his story of Russia's past, and I think you put it as, does he praise revolutionaries or does he side with losers? It's a very difficult question for him.
Yeah, that whole revolutionary period for the Putin regime is difficult for exactly that reason. And all the sort of anniversaries from 2017 They went almost unmarked in Russia. He played it right down, and all the iconography and so on he uses now. It's all drawn from Tsarist Russia. It's not from communist Russia anymore, except with the exception of the Second World War. So you get the double-headed eagle and the tricolor and so on alongside, but just in reference to the Great Patriotic War. You never call it the Second World War. It's always the Great Patriotic. So the sort of eagle perches alongside the hammer and sickle. It's this sort of pick and mix view of history, obviously not talked about at all. Alongside 1917 is sort of Gulag, the Russo-Japanese War, the Crimean War. Is there anything where Russia lost? I mean, his politicization of history is a big theme, as we know. This sort of crank, fake version of history is what he's been using to justify the Ukrainian war. And it's hard to know if he actually believes it himself. I think he actually believes it. I don't think it's just sort of cynical manipulation of the fact. I mean, I think he's really obsessional about Ukraine. And it's interesting reading about the white leaders during the Russian Civil War, reading the memoirs they wrote afterwards, which they wrote always in exile in Paris or New York or London or wherever. It's almost like reading Kremlin propaganda today, because so when the Russian Empire collapsed, all these national governments declared themselves. So you've got Georgian government and army, Baltic ones, Ukrainian one, Finnish one, and so on. And had the white Russians, the anti-Bolshevik Russians, deigned to cooperate with them to do a deal saying, we'll give you independence, we'll recognise you as independent or at least autonomous in exchange for military cooperation, they might have actually won the Civil War, and we might have ended up with a right-wing military dictatorship in Russia through the 20s and 30s instead of communism. But the White Russians, they would not do it. I mean, the Allies were always trying to get them to build an anti-Bolshevik front. There were always all these diplomatic initiatives going on, and they would not do it. They just would not conceive of such a thing as an independent Estonia. I collected a lot of wonderful quotes along these lines, like that's a absurd idea. There is no such thing as an Estonian intelligentsia. Or when Sir Mannerheim of Finland sort of lays down conditions, they say, how can little Finland, dictate to Mother Russia? You'd have thought that Finland had beaten Russia. And it's just that mindset. It's exactly that mindset in the Kremlin now.
But the line about Putin trying to fit it in, it reminded me of years and years ago. I watched Admiral, the very flattering Russian biopic about Admiral Kolchak, and I sort of thought, kind of as you've just said, if things had played out slightly differently, I can't imagine Kolchak would have been a sort of role model for Putin, in the sense of it. You would have had a very deeply conservative, authoritarian state with all sort of the trappings of Imperial Russia, but headed by a sort of quote-unquote charismatic, sober, honourable strongman that Putin would see himself as.
I think that's exactly right. I think that is exactly right. And one thing he did was bring the remains of Denikin, who was the Russian general in the south. He died in America, and his remains, I can't remember which year, probably about 10 years ago now, were brought back from New Jersey and reburied with great pomp and ceremony in one of the Moscow cemeteries. One of the other white generals, Wrangel, who also died abroad, he tried to do the same with him, but the relatives refused. But yes, I mean, I'm sure that analysis is right, and that is an alternative history. It could have gone that way, and we could have had a sort of Russian Franco or Horthy or Piłsudski. It's interesting. I mean, when I embarked on the book, I mean, of course, it was on my mind. Maybe I'm going to be able to write a revisionist history when and I may be able to genuinely, sincerely conclude that if we'd carried on, if we'd made more of an effort in Russia, been more committed, we could have turned history the other way, which of course would have been a good thing, because not even the most sort of repressive military dictator along the kind of lines you're described would have been as bad as Stalin. Nobody imagined the Great Famine, the Holodomor or the Gulag back in 1918, 1919. And the more I found out, the more I realised the whites were always a lost cause. They were not, and they were not only hopeless, they were also ghastly. And I don't know if we'll come on to the white pogroms, which we the Brits turned a blind eye to in Ukraine in 1919. But I mean, they were hopeless. They had no political program. They couldn't command any real degree of popular support. They were disunited. I mean, some of the factors why they lost were structural. So they didn't have the big cities, which were obviously the big recruiting grounds, the industrial base. They didn't have the sub of the railway network, so it's harder for them to move troops around. But by the time the bulk of the British troops arrive in 1918, I mean, everybody on the ground, they realise straight away it's just too disorganised. It's badly led, it's corrupt, they can't face facts in the face, they're sort of fatalistic. The whole middle class is fleeing. It's not going to work. And of course it took London a lot longer to realise that, because on paper it looked like a viable thing. It looks like the whites held great expanses of territory, but the minute you were on the ground, you realised this was illusory.
I mean, another recurring thing in the book is sort of not only, as you said, the whites weren't prepared to cut deals with the Estonians or the Finns because, how could Russia possibly deal with these people? But also internally, the white leaders couldn't conceive of, I guess, making deals along class lines. A lot of the white leaders resented the British sort of promoting, I guess, the serf class to officer positions. And so that was another sort of mental blind spot that the whites just couldn't process or get over to actually go about winning the war.
Yes, there's a lot of that. So they not only can't bear the Brits looking to the non-Russian minorities and supplying and helping them, their national armies, but they don't like the Brits' endless insistence on better treatment of the soldiers. So the prime example of this is in the north is Edmund Ironside. He was endlessly going around the Russian officers saying, you need to be closer to your soldiers. You need to know what they're thinking, and you need to provide some recreation for them, and you need to make sure they're well fed and don't get frostbite and all properly clothed, and sort of rest and recreation, and organise sort of football games and all that, this kind of thing. And this is what part of the young officer's job is to be a bit of a sort of scoutmaster, keeping your troops happy. And one of these sessions, he's given this lecture, and a guy at the back puts up his hands and says, "Do you want us to be valets to our men?" He writes all this up, Ironside, in his diary in the evening, and he sort of puts 3 exclamation marks afterwards. He's exasperated. But the Russians fear their men. And they tell him, you can't trust them. We lived, through 1917, through these great mutinies in the army. We were in fear of our lives. Some of us lost our lives. We were lynched by our men. And Ironside sort of thinks it's all their fault, basically, thinks that's because they didn't treat their men properly. And to set an example, he takes a bunch of prisoners out of the town jail in Archangel and forms them into something called Dyer's Battalion. And this is going to be a model battalion where when he sort of uniforms them, he feeds them up, he trains them properly. It's going to show the Russians what good British methods can do. And he's terrifically proud of them, and he puts them in the front of the parade for the King's birthday, and he shows them off to visiting dignitaries and all this kind of thing. And when he thinks they're ready, he sends them down to the front. And a few weeks later, lo and behold, what happens? They mutiny in the middle of the night, and they poke their rifles in at the windows of the officers' billet and shoot 12 officers dead, 7 Russians, 5 Brits. And so and the whole battalion disappears off into the woods. And Ironside, who's emotionally invested in this project, is absolutely distraught And he, writes in his diary, this is, I can't bear to think of it. This is the worst thing I've seen since, in the whole 5 years of war. And after that, he's sort of like a prick balloon. He's been incredibly, he was a very successful, he went on to become a field marshal and Churchill's chief of Imperial General Staff at the beginning of the Second World War. So he's an incredibly good and committed professional soldier. But after the Dyer's Mutiny, he just wants out of Russia. He's done. That's it for him. So we were naive. The Russians were right that we were naive.
We've kind of briefly touched on this, but something else resisting Putin's historical narrative is Ukraine. And I read Borderland, your phenomenal book about the country, just after the 2022 invasion. And an overarching theme of it seems to be how Ukraine lives rent-free in the minds of Russian rulers. And I think you say about how the seeming closeness of the two cultures, but with important differences, is something that's just always been an irritation to Moscow and St. Petersburg.
I think that's right. I think Russia and Russians, to generalize, feel a sense of ownership over Ukraine, which they don't quite feel over the Balts or the Georgians or the Kazakhs. It's quite obvious why a sort of Georgian or a Kazakh isn't Russian. It's not so obvious with the case of Ukrainians. The differences are more subtle. It's more of a, it's England, Ireland or England, Scotland, not England, India. And it's been ruled for a long time by Russia. So Kiev came under Russian rule in the 1680s. The west of Ukraine, much, much later, not until after the Second World War. It had never been ruled by Russia at all until the Red Army marched in 1944. So Russians, it's interesting. I think sort of Russians, they're very, and it's true, the Ukrainian independence movement through perestroika was smaller and later to develop than those in other Soviet republics. It got going massively, but slightly later than others. And, and Ukrainians do have a lot of links with Russia. A lot of people have, relatives in Russia or they've worked in Russia at some stage. But that's true more of sort of my generation, the middle-aged. If you talk to Ukrainian under sort of 50, they're very likely never to have visited Russia these days, in their entire lives. And I sometimes, that not obviously now post this new war, but back in the day, I'd sort of sometimes push people gently on this, just to see what their reaction was and say, sort of, aren't you tempted to go and have a look at the Hermitage or something? And they'd go, no, I'd be ashamed to tell my friends I was going to Russia on holiday. And this is particularly so. The real sea change moment was 2014, the Maidan. When he was a Putin puppet, really, this man called Yanukovych. He reneged on a trade deal with the EU at Putin's insistence. There were then massive pro-EU demonstrations, which got bigger and bigger and bigger and turned into street fighting with the police. And then the police ended up shooting about 100 demonstrators dead. And yet demonstrations did not recede. This is a big difference between Ukrainians and Russians. First of all, the pro-democracy demonstrations in 2014 in Ukraine, they were 1 million strong at weekends, all through the winter, people camping out. Whereas, then the security forces shoot at them and they don't recede, they keep on coming, they don't disperse. Whereas in Russia, the 2011 pro-democracy demonstrations, then the demonstrations in February 22 against this new war, it's never been more than tens of thousands, in each city at a time. And people are arrested and then they don't come back. They peter out. And, democracy is, being part of the West, part of a normal country, that's always, for Russians, there are some Russians who really care. So they're very brave, committed people, but they're a minority. It's a sort of minority, middle-class, urban pursuit. Whereas in Ukraine, that desire to get away from Moscow, become a normal country, become part of, the European mainstream, that cuts right across regions and classes. I remember, for example, after the Maidan, Yanukovych, this ghastly, sort of grotesquely corrupt president, his whole he had this great big complex, this sort of unbelievably sort of gopingly vulgar complex, sort of full of unopened boxes of Hermes China dinner services and things, was sort of thrown open to the public, and everybody went round it, sort of with their mouths open, not sure whether to laugh or cry. And I remember going around it with my taxi driver, who was an elderly guy and sort of simple guy, and sort of, his taxi was sort of beat up old Jiggly or something. And we came across these pair of young students who were obviously from rather well-off families. And my taxi driver had not said anything just as we were walking around. And I got chatting with the students. And I was saying, so are you going to fight for Ukraine if Russia invades? What are you going to do? And they said, of course we're going to fight for Ukraine. This is our country. We've always lived here. We're Ukrainians. And the taxi driver, who up to that moment hadn't said a word, steps forward, this much older guy, and shakes both these young privileged guys by the hand and says, well done, lads. That's right. I will too. And that sort of solidarity, and it's across regions as well, West and East. It doesn't really exist in Russia. It's not the same.
It's a good segue is that before I sort of read Borderland, I understood the stakes of the war intellectually. So I understood that, why it was geopolitically important that Ukraine resist Russian aggression. But after reading Borderland, it kind of made me appreciate what was at stake psychologically for Ukrainians. Just this idea of, given how repeatedly Russian rulers have sort of brutalized Ukraine over the centuries, the fact that Ukraine has now inflicted such stunning defeats on an army that historically has always put it down. And now you have a situation where Ukrainians are actually invading and occupying Russian land. I just sort of thought that, I guess for many Ukrainians, it's expanded maybe what historically they believe was possible for their country.
Well, on this latest, on this Ukrainian, incursion into Russia towards Kursk, it's, I hope it's a gamble that pays off. I mean, I hope it does relieve pressure on the Donbass, and I hope it does start to change minds in Russia about the advisability of this whole war. What I really hope, I'm not privy, obviously, to what's going on between governments, but I really hope that the Ukrainian government had sign off from the states in particular for it. Presumably, it did have, and this isn't this, this isn't the beginning of the sort of fraying of the pro-Ukraine alliance. I also hope that, because Russia's obviously going to get its act together and fight back around on that area, and I really hope that we don't get hundreds, thousands of Ukrainian troops sacrificed to hold on to a sort of small pocket of untenable territory. So that is something they've done on the other side of the Dnieper. They made this sort of symbolic landing on the eastern side of the river, and they've held on to this tiny pocket of militarily pointless territory at an enormous cost. It can't be supplied across the river. So, I mean, I think the reasons behind it are probably less military than strategic. I think it's probably more about sort of getting onto the front foot. As far as the outside world is concerned, and also for the domestic audience. Because I was last in Ukraine in May, and it was extremely downbeat. People extremely worried about mobilization. So the first sort of heroic phase of the war, when there's massive amount of volunteerism and the recruiting offices were besieged and everybody was running on adrenaline. That's very much over, and people were very, very weary of it and very sort of beaten down by this sort of endless bad news from the front. And I think this will have raised people's spirits, Ukrainian spirits. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why Zelensky decided to do it.
Saw a line from the new commander-in-chief where he encapsulated the strategic problem that Ukraine has, which is that he said the Russians have 3 times of everything. 3 times more men, 3 times more sort of material, 3 times more planes. And so therefore Ukraine has to figure out how to fight smart, because on pure sort of raw numbers terms, Russia can always throw more stuff into the fight.
Well, that's why it's important to carry on supplying Ukraine to even that up in terms of equipment. And the other thing, people talk about time being on Russia's side. I don't think it is necessarily. 40% of the budget is now being spent on the war. Inflation's right up. I can't remember the number. Interest rates are right up. They've spent down a third, 40% or something. I'd have to look up the numbers of the National Wealth Fund. They're becoming increasingly reliant on China, and Russian-Chinese relations are, historically very scratchy indeed. And Russians themselves don't like Chinese immigration, of which there's a lot. I mean, every Siberian town and city has a Kitaisky Rynok, a Chinese market where Chinese traders are selling sort of cheap clothing and consumer goods. And Russians simultaneously shop at these markets, but dislike them. There's still that sort of yellow peril feeling, particularly in Siberia. There's the feeling that Siberia is very poor and very thinly populated, eastern Siberia, and China it's got an enormous population and is economically booming. There's that sort of feeling of threat.
I mean, there's a really good book called Sinostan. I think it came out about 2 years ago, and it's a bit of a heavy book. It's a bit of a heavy academic book, and it's very interesting. And it's these two guys who, over about 10 years, have been sort of traveling around Central Asia. And the book is about how the future of Chinese power isn't the Pacific, it's Central Asia. And over the last 10 years or so, China has just been pushing Russia out of influence in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, because Central Asia has all the raw materials that China needs for its sort of economic success. And that's where you get sort of the Belt and Road Initiative and everything like that. And I think this book came out before the large-scale invasion in 22. And I would imagine over the last 2 years, that process has speeded up because Russia has had to commit so much to Ukraine that I guess something that always frustrates me about the reporting of Putin is the impression that's given that he'd be doing us a favor if he ends the war in Ukraine. Whereas actually, I've always thought Putin is he's very good at sleights of hand. And actually, it's important for Russia to end this war as soon as possible, both because of how much they're spending on it, but also how much China is sort of displacing it in Central Asia. But from a lot of the reporting, and then the reporting in the West, it's very much like Putin is doing us a favor if he winds this up. So therefore, we need to make the effort to sort of end it.
I quite agree. I mean, Russia has always had a sort of unearned sort of glamour to it. And of course, it is a nuclear power, but it's also to an extent a paper tiger. You have to keep remembering its economy is the size of Italy's. Its entire economy is the size of that of one medium-sized European country. It can't sustain this for long. And I mean, Putin knows it because he's obsessional, but he's also not completely irrational. So he hasn't been conscripting in the big cities of European Russia. He's been basically paying large salaries to get the soldiers he needs from the poorest areas, from the backwoods, and he knows that he's not going to be able to get the new middle classes round to this. People don't want to have to go off and die in the Donbass. People don't want to lose their sons for somewhere like Slavyansk. They may feel a certain sense of sort of regret and and sort of insult that that Ukraine is no longer part of Russia and the Ukrainians are waltzing off into the arms of Europe, but they don't want to actually lose their lives trying to get it back. And then amongst the Russian elites, one assumes there are some, there are obviously some ideologues, and Putin's own close circle, they are ideologues, and he got very close to this sort of small group during COVID when he shut himself away and read lots of sort of crazy conspiracy theory, pseudo philosophical historical literature. But the wider elites contain, they're pragmatists, and they they're not Democrats, but they're pragmatists, and they may well, and one hopes that they are. There are a lot of people who think that making Russia totally dependent on China, Ukraine's not worth it, and they'd like a settlement, and they'd like lives, their lives to go back as normal, and they can start enjoying their yachts and their villas again.
Something else that struck me about Borderland, and it kind of ties with all this reading that Putin was doing when he was shut up, was that Putin and sort of Russian nationalists often accuse the Ukrainians of doing things that they did on a much bigger scale. So, sort of when Putin or Russian nationalists call Ukrainians Nazis for cooperating with the Nazis, the whole Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is completely forgotten in that narrative. It's very much Russia resisting the Nazis, not the Soviet Union resisting the Nazis. And that whole bit at the beginning is forgotten. And then sort of in the book, you also talk about how many Ukrainians either passively went along with the Holocaust or just sort of stayed out of it, which is another sort of thing that Russians will use as a stick with which to beat Ukrainians. I'm not talking about sort of Russian pogroms, the white pogroms, or anything like that.
Or indeed, of course, of collaboration in, German-occupied Russia during the Second World War. Yes, I mean it's true. The sort of the Nazi sort of Ukraine, the Kiev government is Nazi thing is it's sort of it's laughable, obviously, but it's it's going back to an old Soviet propaganda trope, which was to denigrate the Ukrainian national movement by associating it with Nazism and saying that Ukrainians all collaborated with Germany during the Great Patriotic War. And some Ukrainians did indeed collaborate with Germany, but a great many more, sort of 5-10 times more, fought in the Red Army. Willy-nilly, whether they liked it or not. And of course, lots and lots of Russians ended up fighting for Hitler as well. As anyone who's read Anthony Beevor's books will know. So, it's extraordinary nonetheless. These sort of really sort of absurd propaganda tropes, like, Zelensky's a Nazi. Zelensky, who's Jewish, is a Nazi. That sort of but it's amazing the traction they have in Russia amongst ordinary Russians. So, an absolutely universal Ukrainian experience for people who've got relatives in Russia is you ring up sort of Auntie Olga in Nizhny Novgorod or something, and you say to her, "What listen to the explosions. I'm holding my phone up to the window. Listen to the explosions and the anti-air raid sirens. This is what your army is doing to us." And Auntie Olga goes, "No, it's a provocatia. This is your army. They're bombing you. Come to me in Nizhny Novgorod, where you'll be safe from those horrible Nazis who've taken over in Ukraine." And this is really common reaction on the part of Russians. This sort of absolute retreat into this sort of nationalist fantasy. And it's always accompanied by sort of we're peaceful people. We mirni люди. We're this sort of gentility, this sort of hanging on to respectability is terribly important for people. There's polling obviously in Russia is no longer to be relied upon, but it feels people try and assess it. Generally say that about 25% of the countries strongly pro-Putin and pro the war, 25% is strongly against, and the other 50% are putting their heads in the sand. And I think that feels about right.
Related to that, I think, is a sort of difference when it comes to this this 20th century history. I guess the sort of difference is that Ukrainians are processing it, sort of the Holocaust and dark periods like that, whereas the Russians don't process that history.
No, I mean, it's really sad. So in the 90s, when all the archives opened, and the press, press and pub, somebody got free speech in Russia, there was this wonderful flowering of Russian scholarship and a lot of fantastic stuff published, including a lot of the stuff I drew on from Nasty Little War, a whole bunch, lots of Russian memoirs and diaries and so on were published, and edited and published by a terrific academic up in Archangel at the university there. And now, of course, that's all gone into reverse. So you can't get into the archives anymore. So not only foreigners can't get in, but if you're a Russian scholar, you have to get permission, which means you have to be sort of well looked upon by the authorities. The deans of all the universities have been replaced by loyalists, and you have to sort of keep signing petitions in support of Putin. There's a lot of self censorship. So some publishing houses still manage to publish quite controversial stuff, but it's always sort of very low key for a sort of small academic audience, very small print runs. But largely, all the best young academics have all gone abroad. I mean, I did a big book on the siege of Leningrad, on the Second World War siege of Leningrad in the early 2000s, and all the people I work with on that, they've all gone abroad now. And those who haven't are often, they've retreated into non-controversial subjects. So, for example, one young woman I interviewed up in the north, and she was looking at Gulag graves up there, NKVD mass graves, and sort of tracing the history of the Gulag up in the north, which is where it began. That was its birthplace. And since then, she's swapped to looking at sort of fish processing, sort of industrial fisheries after the Second World War. Hardly a hot topic. So there's a lot of that going on as well. So I'm afraid, history. There was lots of processing of history and facing up to history, and very great, fierce interest in history in the 90s, and that's all absolutely gone. And people are telling themselves now this fantastical, version of history, which is easy for them to live with and boosts their self-esteem. These nationalist fables.
So my two last questions is there anything you're working on now?
At the moment, I'm interested. I mean, I'm doing stuff. I'm not embarking on other history. I'm writing about Ukraine and going to Ukraine regularly, and I find it I mean, it's obviously it's obviously very involving in all sorts of ways, but it's also it's extraordinarily interesting to see to see a country at war, a big European country at war, and you see all these all these sort of behaviours and phenomena and so on that you've read about in the books come to life. I know for a lot of us, sort of seeing Ukrainians sheltering in the metro stations, it was extraordinary. It was like seeing the Blitz brought to life, and going there. And I mean, I've got a great raft of old friends and acquaintances and work contacts there, and talking to them, it's endlessly fascinating.
Just started reading Alexander Mikhed's The Language of War.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that.
It's very good. He is a Ukrainian writer who he's just brought a book out. I think it's a Penguin book. It's his sort of diary of the war, sort of processing what's gone on and sort of Russian crimes. His parents lived in Bucha, and so I started reading that, and it's very raw. It's very eloquent as well.
Yeah, actually, I think I did read the reviews. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic writing coming out of Ukraine at the moment. And there's a very good literary festival in Lviv each autumn, which I recommend people to go to, because you can get to Lviv perfectly easily and it's safe. And you hear these people talking so fascinatingly about their experiences and their work. And last year everyone was saying that it was too early for fiction. People haven't, it's all about diaries and essays still at this stage, and it's all too raw and it's too happening and you're too in the present to start turning it into novels.
I mean, something I've been doing this year is big train journeys across Europe. So I have been thinking of getting the train to Lviv, but I'm not sure my mum will let me. So
Tell her you'll be absolutely fine. You're much more likely to get, killed crossing Charing Cross Road.
And then my last question is, have you managed to settle on a favourite word?
Oh my goodness. Oh Lord, I'm sorry. You've been asking me, firing questions at me, and I haven't thought of one. What should we think of? Well, here's. Should we just say freedom? Why not?
It's nice. Anna Reid, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
As well as thanking Anna again, I'd also like to thank everyone who's made Strategy Aaron the 167th most popular politics podcast on Apple. You people are the real stars. If you want to buy any of Anna's books, as well as support independent stores in the UK, check out my bookshop page in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you liked and commented on whichever platform you're listening, and then maybe we can get to 166th. Next week, I'll be talking to Carl Cashman, a friend of mine and a rising star in British politics. Thanks for listening.